The radar screen showed 12 hostile blips closing in fast. Captain Sarah Martinez had trained for this moment her entire career, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. In just 2 minutes and 37 seconds, she would rewrite the history books and prove that sometimes being outnumbered 12-1 isn't a disadvantage. It's an opportunity. What started as a routine patrol mission over contested airspace would become the most documented air-to-air combat engagement of the 21st century. 12 enemy fighters thought they had cornered a single pilot. They were about to discover they had awakened a legend. This is the true story of how one woman turned the skies into her personal battlefield and emerged as the most feared pilot in modern warfare. The morning sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson as Captain Sarah Martinez performed her pre-flight inspection on the F-22 Raptor. Her fingers moved with practiced precision across each surface, checking every rivet, every panel, every system that would keep her alive 30,000 feet above the earth. The aircraft gleamed in the early light, its angular stealth design making it look more like a sculpture than a weapon of war. Sarah had been flying for 12 years, but this particular morning felt different. There was tension in the air at Kadena Air Base, a heaviness that seemed to press down on everyone's shoulders. Intelligence reports had been flooding in for weeks about increased enemy activity in the disputed airspace near the South China Sea. What had started as routine reconnaissance flights had escalated into something far more dangerous. "Martinez, you ready for this?" called out Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez as he approached her aircraft. Rodriguez had been her commanding officer for 3 years, and she had never seen him look this serious. His usual easy smile was replaced by a tight line across his weathered face. "Always ready, sir," Sarah replied, though her stomach churned with anticipation. She had flown over 200 combat missions, but something about today's briefing had left her unsettled. The mission parameters were unusual, almost provocative. A single aircraft patrol in heavily contested airspace seemed less like reconnaissance and more like bait. Rodriguez handed her a sealed envelope. "New orders came in 20 minutes ago. Eyes only. Don't open it until you're airborne and clear of friendly airspace." The weight of the envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained more than just paper and ink. Sarah tucked the envelope into her flight suit and continued her inspection. Every pilot had their own ritual, their own way of preparing for the possibility that this might be their last flight. For Sarah, it was the methodical check of every system, every backup, every contingency. Her father had taught her that preparation was the difference between heroes and casualties. Colonel Martinez had been a pilot himself, flying F-16s during the Gulf War. He had told her stories of aerial combat that seemed almost mythical, tales of split-second decisions and impossible maneuvers that separated the living from the dead. In the air, he would say, "You're only as good as your worst-case scenario planning." Those words had guided her through every mission, every training exercise, every moment of doubt. As she climbed into the cockpit, Sarah felt the familiar embrace of the pilot's seat. The F-22 was more than an aircraft. It was an extension of her will, a fusion of human intuition and technological supremacy. Every switch, every display, every control surface was exactly where her muscle memory expected it to be. This was her domain, her element. The pre-flight checklist scrolled across her heads-up display as she powered up the systems. Engine temperatures, hydraulic pressure, weapon status, electronic countermeasures, communications array. Everything showed green. The twin Pratt and Whitney engines hummed to life with a sound that never failed to send adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Tower, this is Falcon 1 requesting clearance for departure," Sarah spoke into her helmet microphone. Her call sign, Falcon, had been earned during her first combat deployment when she had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to spot enemy aircraft before her radar could even detect them. "Falcon 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Runway 27 left. Winds are 230 at 8 knots. Have a safe flight out there, Captain." Sarah pushed the throttles forward, feeling the incredible force of the F-22's engines pressing her back into her seat. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with the fury of a caged predator finally released. At 150 knots, she pulled back on the stick, and the Raptor leaped into the air as if gravity itself had released its hold. The climb was steep and fast. Within minutes, she was passing through 20,000 feet, the world below shrinking into a patchwork of colors and shapes. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, a blue canvas broken only by the occasional ship or island. At this altitude, the curvature of the Earth became visible, a reminder of just how small and fragile human civilization truly was. Control, Falcon 1 is airborne and proceeding to waypoint Alpha, Sarah reported as she leveled off at 35,000 feet. The autopilot engaged, allowing her to focus on the envelope that seemed to burn against her chest. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The orders were brief, but chilling. Proceed to coordinates 118.5 east, 14.2 north. Conduct aerial reconnaissance of suspected enemy buildup. Rules of engagement. Weapons free on hostile contact. Priority intelligence suggests possible ambush scenario. Exercise extreme caution. Sarah's blood ran cold as she processed the implications. The coordinates placed her deep in contested airspace, far from any friendly support. If this was indeed an ambush, she would be facing unknown numbers of enemy fighters with no backup and no hope of reinforcement. It was either a suicide mission or a test of something she couldn't yet comprehend. She programmed the coordinates into her navigation system and felt the aircraft bank smoothly to the east. The autopilot disengaged as she took manual control, her hands settling naturally on the stick and throttles. Whatever lay ahead, she would meet it on her own terms. The flight to the target coordinates took 43 minutes. For most of that time, Sarah flew in radio silence, her radar in passive mode to avoid detection. The F-22's stealth capabilities would keep her invisible to most enemy sensors, but she knew that advantage was only temporary. The moment she went active with her radar or engaged any targets, her position would be broadcast to every hostile aircraft in the area. As she approached the coordinates, Sarah's threat warning system began to chirp softly. Multiple radar signatures were painting the area ahead, suggesting a significant enemy presence. She switched her radar to active mode for a brief scan and nearly gasped at what she saw. 12 contact. 12 enemy fighters arranged in what appeared to be a classic ambush formation. They were positioned at various altitudes between 20 and 40,000 feet, spread across a 20-mile radius. It was a trap, and she had flown directly into it. Control, Falcon 1. I have 12 hostile contacts in Sector 77. Repeat, 12 confirmed hostiles. Her voice remained steady despite the hammering of her heart. The response crackled through her headphones with barely contained urgency. Falcon 1. Those numbers are confirmed. You are cleared to engage. Repeat, you are weapons free. Sarah looked at her weapons display. 6 a.m., 1 20 AMRAAM missiles, and 2 AIM, 9 Sidewinders. 8 missiles against 12 enemy fighters. The mathematics were brutally simple, and they were not in her favor. But mathematics didn't account for skill, for training, for the thousands of hours she had spent perfecting her craft. Mathematics didn't account for the fire that burned in her chest every time someone suggested that a woman couldn't handle the rigors of aerial combat. Mathematics had never met Captain Sarah Martinez. She armed her weapon systems and felt the familiar click as the master arm switch engaged. The enemy fighters were beginning to converge on her position, their formation tightening like a noose. In minutes, possibly seconds, the sky would explode into chaos. Sarah took a deep breath and pushed the throttles to full military power. The F-22 surged forward with incredible acceleration, its twin engines screaming their defiance at the odds ahead. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely alone. It was exactly where she wanted to be. The first missile launch came from her 11 o'clock position, a streak of white smoke trailing across the blue sky like a deadly signature. Sarah's threat warning system exploded into a cacophony of alarms as multiple missile locks painted her aircraft. The enemy had revealed their positions, and now the real battle would begin. "Missile inbound, 11 o'clock," she called out, though no one could hear her except the vast emptiness of the sky. Her training kicked in with mechanical precision. She rolled the aircraft, inverted, and pulled hard, the G-forces pressing her deep into her ejection seat. The missile streaked past her canopy, close enough that she could see the small fins adjusting its flight path as it tried to track her maneuver. The F-22's electronic countermeasures system launched a pattern of chaff and flares, filling the air around her with metallic strips and burning decoys designed to confuse incoming missiles. Sarah had practiced this dance 1,000 times in simulators, but the real thing was different. The real thing had consequences that no computer program could replicate. Another missile launch, this time from her 2 o'clock. Then, another from her 6. The enemy fighters were coordinating their attack, trying to overwhelm her defensive systems with multiple simultaneous threats. It was textbook tactics, the kind of maneuver that would have spelled certain death for most pilots. Sarah Martinez was not most pilots. She rolled left and pulled the aircraft into a violent climbing turn, using the F-22's incredible thrust-to-weight ratio to gain altitude and energy. The second missile passed beneath her, its proximity fuse failing to detonate as she climbed above its engagement envelope. The third missile, however, was tracking perfectly. At the last possible second, Sarah chopped the throttles and deployed the aircraft's speed brakes. The sudden deceleration caused the missile to overshoot, its seeker head losing lock as it flew past her position. She immediately pushed the throttles back to full power and rolled into an aggressive dive, using gravity to add to her acceleration. "Control, Falcon 1 is engaged. Multiple hostiles, multiple missiles inbound," she reported, her voice steady despite pulling nearly 8 Gs in her defensive maneuver. The enemy fighters were closing fast, their initial missile barrage having failed to achieve its intended effect. Sarah's heads-up display showed the tactical situation in stark detail. The 12 enemy fighters were organized into 3 groups of 4, approaching from different vectors. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to prevent her from escaping while maximizing their chances of achieving a kill. They had studied her capabilities, prepared for her strengths, and positioned themselves accordingly. They had made one critical mistake. They had assumed she would try to run. Instead, Sarah turned directly toward the nearest group of fighters and armed her first AMRAAM missile. The AM-120 was one of the most sophisticated air-to-air weapons ever created, capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 50 miles. But Sarah preferred to get close, to make every shot count in a way that left no room for error or countermeasures. The lead fighter in the nearest group was a Su-35, a formidable aircraft with advanced avionics and experienced pilots. Sarah could see the distinctive canard configuration and twin vertical stabilizers as the enemy fighter closed to within 30 miles. The pilot was good, maintaining proper spacing and altitude while his wingmen covered his flanks. Sarah waited until the range closed to 20 miles, then fired her first AMRAAM. The missile dropped from the F-22's internal weapons bay and ignited its rocket motor, accelerating to over 3 times the speed of sound. The enemy pilot immediately began defensive maneuvers, launching his own countermeasures and turning hard to break the missile's lock. But the AIM-120 was relentless. Its active radar seeker tracked every movement, every turn, every desperate attempt to escape. At a range of 5 miles, the missile's proximity fuse triggered, sending a cloud of tungsten fragments into the Su-35's starboard engine. The enemy fighter rolled over and began trailing smoke, its pilot fighting to maintain control as warning lights filled his cockpit. "Splash 1, Sarah announced, though her celebration was brief. The remaining 11 fighters had adjusted their tactics, spreading out to make coordinated attacks more difficult while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. They were learning, adapting to her capabilities in real time. The The second group of fighters had climbed to 45,000 feet, trying to gain an altitude advantage that would allow them to dive down on her position with superior energy. Sarah watched them climb and smiled grimly. Altitude was an advantage only if you could maintain it, and the F-22's climb rate was legendary. She pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft leap upward, the twin engines pushing her toward the stratosphere with overwhelming power. The enemy fighters had reached their service ceiling, but Sarah was just getting started. At 50,000 feet, she leveled off and looked down at her opponents like a hawk surveying prey. The tactical advantage was now hers. From this altitude, she could see the entire battlefield spread out below her. The enemy fighters looked like toys, their attempts at coordinated movement transparent and predictable. Sarah selected her second AMRAAM and locked onto the lead fighter in the high group. This pilot was smarter than the first. As soon as Sarah's missile launched, he rolled inverted and dove toward the Earth, using gravity to add to his escape velocity while deploying countermeasures in a complex pattern. His wingmen followed suit, turning the sky into a constellation of flares and metallic chaff. Sarah's missile tracked the lead fighter for 30 seconds before losing lock in the cloud of countermeasures. But she had anticipated this possibility and was already maneuvering for a follow-up shot. She rolled the F-22 into a steep dive, using her altitude advantage to close the distance rapidly. At 20,000 feet, she was moving at nearly Mach 1.8, her airspeed building as she descended. The enemy fighters were spread out below her, their defensive maneuvers having scattered their formation. This was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Scattered enemies could be defeated piecemeal, each one isolated and vulnerable. She pulled out of her dive at 15,000 feet and immediately climbed back up, using the F-22's incredible agility to reverse her vertical momentum. The maneuver, known as a yo-yo, positioned her behind one of the enemy fighters at close range. The Su-35 pilot never saw her coming. Sarah's third AMRAAM launched at point-blank range, only 8 miles separating her from the target. The missile had barely enough time to arm its warhead before impact. The explosion tore through the enemy fighter's fuselage, breaking it in half in a spectacular fireball that lit up the afternoon sky. Splash 2, she reported, already turning toward the next threat. But her celebration was premature. The remaining 10 fighters had regrouped and were converging on her position from multiple directions. Missile launch warnings filled her cockpit as the enemy unleashed a coordinated barrage of their own weapons. 5 missiles inbound. 5 chances to die if she made even the smallest mistake. Sarah's training took over completely, her conscious mind stepping aside to let years of practice and preparation guide her actions. She rolled right, climbed left, dove down, and climbed again, her flight path resembling a 3-dimensional spiral that made her nearly impossible to target. One missile passed close enough to her left wing that she could see the Cyrillic writing on its warhead. Another detonated close enough to pepper her aircraft with small fragments, causing minor damage to her left vertical stabilizer. The warning system screamed at her, but the F-22 continued to fly with a reliability that had made it the most feared fighter aircraft in the world. As the missile barrage ended, Sarah found herself in the middle of a fur ball, with enemy fighters at every point of the compass. This was where the real test would begin. Close-range combat, where split-second decisions and superior piloting skills would determine who lived and who died. She armed her Sidewinder missiles and prepared for the fight of her life. The dogfight that followed would be analyzed by military strategists for decades to come. 10 enemy fighters swarmed around Sarah's F-22 like angry hornets, each pilot skilled enough to have survived the initial engagement and desperate enough to take increasingly dangerous risks. The sky became a 3-dimensional chessboard where every move carried the possibility of sudden, violent death. Sarah's first Sidewinder shot came at a Su-35 that had made the mistake of turning in front of her at close range. The AIM-9's infrared seeker locked onto the enemy fighter's exhaust signature, and the missile streaked away with a distinctive whoosh. The enemy pilot saw it coming and tried to turn away, but physics was against him. The Sidewinder's proximity fuse detonated just behind his left engine, sending shrapnel through the aircraft's vital systems. The Su-35 began trailing fire and smoke as its pilot struggled to maintain control. Sarah watched him for a split second, confirming the kill, before immediately rolling away to avoid the two fighters that were converging on her position from above. In aerial combat, stopping to admire your work was a luxury that could prove fatal. "Splash 3, she called out, her voice tight with concentration as she pulled nearly 9 Gs in a climbing turn. The enemy pilots were getting more aggressive now, closing to ranges where their cannon could be effective. Sarah could see tracer rounds streaking past her canopy, bright lines of death that missed her by mere feet. A Su-30 appeared in her peripheral vision, coming in from her 4 o'clock position with guns blazing. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled through the vertical, using the F-22's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to outclimb her pursuer. The enemy pilot followed her up, but his heavier aircraft couldn't match the Raptor's climb rate. As he fell behind, Sarah reversed her turn and found herself with a perfect shot opportunity. Her second Sidewinder launched at a range of only 3 miles. The Su-30 pilot never had a chance to react. The missile struck his aircraft just behind the cockpit, the explosion severing the forward fuselage from the rest of the fighter. Sarah flew through the debris cloud, pieces of metal and composite material bouncing off her canopy like deadly hail. "Splash 4, she reported, but there was no time to celebrate. 2 more fighters were positioning themselves for a coordinated attack, while another pair climbed to gain an altitude advantage. The enemy pilots were learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics to exploit any weakness they could find in her defenses. Sarah's fuel gauge showed that she had burned through nearly 40% of her capacity. The constant high-G maneuvering and full-power climbs were consuming fuel at an alarming rate. In a prolonged engagement, endurance could become as important as ammunition, and she was starting to feel the pressure of both constraints. The next attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. For fighters dove on her position, while 2 more climbed to cut off her escape route. It was a textbook hammer-in, anvil maneuver designed to crush her between opposing forces. Sarah had seen this tactic before and knew that the only way to defeat it was through speed and unpredictability. She pushed the throttles to full afterburner and rolled into a steep dive, accelerating past Mach 2 as she descended toward the ocean below. The enemy fighters followed, their formation tightening as they pursued her toward the waves. Sarah waited until they were committed to their dive, then executed a maneuver that pushed the F-22 to the very limits of its structural envelope. At only 5,000 feet above the ocean, she pulled back on the stick with tremendous force, hauling the aircraft through a crushing 11G turn that changed her direction by almost 90 degrees. The pursuing fighters, unable to match her turn rate, overshot her position and found themselves scattered across several miles of airspace. This was the opportunity Sarah had been waiting for. The enemy formation was broken, their mutual support compromised by their failed attack. She could now engage them individually, using the F-22's superior maneuverability to isolate and destroy each fighter in turn. The nearest Su-35 was climbing desperately, trying to regain altitude and energy after his failed diving attack. Sarah rolled behind him and locked up his exhaust signature with her remaining Sidewinder. The missile shot away and impacted the enemy fighter's starboard engine, causing a massive explosion that tore the wing from the fuselage. "Splash 5, she announced, but her celebration was cut short by the distinctive sound of cannon fire. A MiG-29 had maneuvered behind her while she was engaging the Su-35, and now his 30mm cannon was stitching a line of destruction across her flight path. Sarah felt the aircraft shudder as several rounds struck her port wing, causing warning lights to illuminate across her instrument panel. She rolled hard left and pulled into a vertical climb, using the F-22's incredible thrust to escape the MiG's guns. The enemy pilot followed, but his older aircraft couldn't match her climb rate. As the MiG fell behind, Sarah reversed course and dove back down, positioning herself for a head-on attack. With her Sidewinder missiles expended, Sarah armed the F-22's internal cannon. The M61A2 Vulcan was a six-barreled monster capable of firing over 6,000 rounds per minute. At close range, it was devastatingly effective, but it required precise marksmanship and perfect timing. The MiG-29 was coming straight at her, its pilot confident that a head-on gun engagement would favor his more experienced hands. Sarah waited until the range closed to under a mile, then squeezed the trigger. The Vulcan roared to life, sending a stream of 20mm projectiles toward the enemy fighter at incredible velocity. The MiG pilot saw the muzzle flashes and tried to roll away, but he was too late. Sarah's rounds stitched across his cockpit and engine bay, critical systems failing in a cascade of smoke and flame. The enemy fighter rolled over and began its final dive toward the ocean, its pilot already reaching for his ejection handles. "Splash 6, Sarah called out, her voice hoarse from the constant G-forces and combat stress. But even as one threat was eliminated, others were positioning themselves for renewed attacks. The remaining 4 enemy fighters had regrouped at high altitude, and they were descending toward her position with the fury of pilots who had watched their comrades die. Sarah checked her ammunition status. She had 4 AMRAAM missiles remaining and approximately 800 rounds of cannon ammunition. For fighters, for missiles, if every shot was perfect. But aerial combat rarely allowed for perfection, and she knew that at least one engagement would likely come down to guns. The enemy formation was approaching from her 12 o'clock, spread out in a line abreast formation that maximized their firepower while minimizing her ability to engage multiple targets. They had learned from the mistakes of their fallen comrades, and were approaching with the methodical precision of veteran pilots who understood that their numerical advantage was slipping away. Sarah climbed to meet them, the F-22's engines screaming at full power as she gained altitude and energy. The coming engagement would determine the outcome of the entire battle. 4 against 1, with nowhere to run and no backup coming. It was the kind of moment that separated legends from casualties. She armed her remaining AMRAAM missiles and prepared for the final phase of what had become the most intense aerial combat engagement of her career. In the next 60 seconds, she would either emerge victorious or become another statistic in the long history of aerial warfare. The enemy fighters were only 10 miles away and closing fast. The final 4 enemy fighters approached with the coordinated precision of a seasoned aerobatic team. Sarah could see them clearly now through her heads-up display. For Sue, 35 flankers spread across a mile of sky, each pilot undoubtedly among the best his country had to offer. They had watched 6 of their comrades fall to her guns and missiles, and they were approaching with the careful aggression of predators who had learned to respect their prey. Sarah's tactical computer painted the threat assessment across her display. Lead fighter at her 12 o'clock, 2 wingmen at 11 and 1 o'clock positions, and a 4th aircraft climbing high to provide cover and coordinate the attack. It was a classic wall formation, designed to present multiple simultaneous threats while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. At 8 miles separation, the lead fighter launched his first missile. The R-77 Adder streaked towards Sarah's position, its active radar seeker painting her aircraft with targeting energy. She immediately rolled right and began a climbing spiral, deploying countermeasures as the missile closed the distance. The enemy had timed their attack perfectly, forcing her into defensive maneuvers just as the other fighters were entering their own engagement envelopes. Sarah's threat warning system screamed as 3 more missiles launched in rapid succession. 4 R-77s inbound from 4 different vectors, each one guided by some of the most sophisticated fire control systems in the world. The sky around her F-22 filled with a metallic flutter of chaff and the brilliant flares of infrared decoys, but she knew that modern missiles were designed to penetrate such defenses. The first missile passed close enough to her starboard wing that she could read the Cyrillic markings on its warhead. Her violent, evasive maneuvers had caused it to lose lock at the last second, sending it tumbling harmlessly toward the ocean below. The second missile detonated 50 feet behind her aircraft, the shrapnel pattern peppering her engines with small fragments that caused her left engine to surge and stumble. Warning lights illuminated her cockpit as the engine management system tried to compensate for the damage. Sarah felt the aircraft yaw slightly as thrust became uneven between her twin engines, but the F-22's flight control computers automatically adjusted to maintain stable flight. She was wounded, but still combat effective, which was more than could be said for most aircraft that had survived such a close detonation. The third and fourth missiles were tracking perfectly, their seeker heads locked onto her heat signature despite her countermeasures. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled through the vertical, using every bit of the F-22's incredible maneuverability to break the missile locks. At the peak of her climb, she rolled right and dove toward the ocean, building speed as gravity added to her engine thrust. One missile lost lock and streaked past her position, but the fourth R-77 was relentless. Its proximity fuse triggered just as Sarah rolled into another evasive maneuver. The explosion close enough to spiderweb her canopy and send a shower of metal fragments through her right wing. More warning lights joined the chorus in her cockpit, but the Raptor continued to fly with the stubborn reliability that had made it legendary. "Control, Falcon 1 is taking damage, but still combat effective," she reported, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The four enemy fighters had closed to within 5 miles and were beginning to separate, each one maneuvering to gain an advantage in the close-range combat that would follow. Sarah's fuel gauge showed critical levels, the constant afterburner usage and combat maneuvering having consumed her reserves at an alarming rate. She had perhaps 10 minutes of full-power flying time remaining, maybe less if she continued pulling high-G maneuvers. Every decision now carried the weight of fuel consumption as well as tactical advantage. The lead Su-35 was turning hard to her left, trying to position himself for a gun attack. Sarah could see the distinctive flash of his cannon muzzle as he opened fire, tracer rounds streaking past her position like deadly fireflies. She rolled away from his attack and found herself face-to-face with one of his wingmen, both aircraft approaching each other at a combined speed of over 1,500 miles per hour. At a range of 3 miles, Sarah fired her first AMRAAM of this final engagement. The missile dropped from her weapons bay and immediately acquired the target, its active seeker painting the enemy fighter with targeting radar. The Su-35 pilot saw the missile launch and immediately began defensive maneuvers, rolling and climbing while deploying countermeasures in a practice pattern. But Sarah had anticipated his response. As the enemy fighter climbed, she rolled beneath him and fired her fifth AMRAAM at close range. The second missile had a perfect shot at the Su-35's exposed belly, striking the aircraft just behind the cockpit. The explosion was tremendous, the enemy fighter disintegrating in a ball of fire and debris that scattered across several miles of sky. "Splash 7, Sarah announced, but there was no time to celebrate. The remaining 3 fighters had coordinated their attacks, and she found herself trapped in a triangle of enemy aircraft, each one positioned to cover the others while maintaining optimal firing solutions. The next few seconds unfolded like a deadly ballet. Sarah rolled left to avoid cannon fire from her 10 o'clock position, only to find herself in the crosshairs of the fighter at her 2 o'clock. She pulled hard right, the G-forces crushing her into her seat as tracer rounds filled the space where her aircraft had been only moments before. Her damaged left engine finally gave up the struggle, flaming out in a shower of sparks and metal fragments. Sarah felt the aircraft yaw violently as thrust dropped to 50%, the flight control computers working overtime to maintain stability. She was now flying on a single engine against 3 of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. But adversity had always brought out the best in Sarah Martinez. With her speed and maneuverability reduced, she would have to rely on tactics, timing, and the one advantage that no enemy pilot could take away from her: experience. She had been flying combat missions longer than some of these pilots had been in the Air Force, and she had never met a situation that couldn't be overcome through skill and determination. The nearest Su-35 was closing for what its pilot clearly intended to be the killing shot. Sarah could see him through her cracked canopy, his aircraft growing larger as he maneuvered into firing position. At a range of 2 miles, she fired her 6th AMRAAM, but the enemy pilot was ready for it. He rolled hard right and dove toward the ocean, his countermeasures creating a cloud of metallic chaff that confused the missile seeker head. Sarah's missile lost lock and streaked harmlessly into the water below, leaving her with only 2 AMRAAMs and less than 5 minutes of fuel. The mathematics of her situation were becoming increasingly grim, but she pushed such thoughts from her mind. Mathematics had never accounted for the human spirit, for the refusal to surrender even when victory seemed impossible. The second enemy fighter was climbing to gain an altitude advantage, while the third maintained position on Sarah's starboard side, ready to engage if she turned toward either of his comrades. It was a classic pincer movement, and Sarah realized that conventional tactics would no longer serve her. She needed to do something unexpected, something that would throw off their coordination and create an opportunity for individual engagement. Sarah rolled her damaged F-22 inverted and pulled through the vertical, climbing straight up despite her reduced engine power. The enemy pilots followed her climb, but their heavier aircraft couldn't match her rate of ascent even with her damaged engine. As they fell behind, Sarah rolled upright at the peak of her climb and found herself perfectly positioned for a diving attack on the lead fighter. Her 7th AMRAAM launched at a range of 4 miles, striking the climbing Su-35 before its pilot could react. The missile impacted the enemy fighter's port engine, causing a catastrophic failure that sent the aircraft tumbling toward the earth in a shower of burning fuel and metal. "Splash 8, Sarah called out, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and combat stress. 2 enemies remained, and she had 1 missile left. The final phase of the battle was about to begin. The 2 remaining enemy fighters separated immediately after watching their comrades' aircraft explode, each pilot now fully aware that they were facing something beyond their training and experience. Sarah could see the change in their tactics, the way they maintained greater separation and approached with the cautious respect accorded to a dangerous adversary. They had entered this engagement expecting an easy victory against a single aircraft. Now, they were the ones fighting for survival. Sarah's fuel warning light had been glowing red for the past 3 minutes, and her damaged left engine was streaming a thin trail of smoke that would make her easy to track visually. She had perhaps 90 seconds of combat power remaining before fuel starvation would force her to reduce throttle settings, effectively ending her ability to maneuver aggressively. Every decision now carried the weight of final consequences. The first Su-35 was positioning himself for a head-on attack, climbing to 30,000 feet before turning back toward her position. The second fighter maintained a high patrol pattern, ready to dive down and engage if his comrade's attack failed. It was sound tactics, but Sarah had fought against such coordinated attacks before. The key was to force them into individual engagements where her superior skills could overcome their numerical advantage. At a range of 6 miles, Sarah fired her final AMRAAM at the approaching Su-35. The missile streaked away with the characteristic white smoke trail that had become familiar over the past 10 minutes of combat. But instead of continuing her approach, Sarah immediately rolled away and dove toward the ocean, using the last of her fuel reserves to build speed for what would be her final maneuver. The enemy pilot saw the missile coming and began his defensive pattern, rolling left and climbing while deploying countermeasures. Sarah's AMRAAM tracked him for 30 seconds before losing lock in a cloud of chaff and flares. The missile detonated harmlessly 1,000 feet from its target, leaving Sarah with no long-range weapons and 2 enemy fighters still in the fight. But the missile had served its purpose. The lead Su-35's defensive maneuvers had brought him down to Sarah's altitude, while his wingman remained high and out of position to provide immediate support. For the next 30 seconds, it would be a one-on-one engagement between two highly skilled pilots, each flying aircraft capable of incredible performance. Sarah rolled behind the Su-35 and armed her cannon. The M61A2 Vulcan had approximately 400 rounds remaining, enough for perhaps 3 or 4 firing opportunities if she was precise with her trigger control. The enemy pilot saw her maneuvering behind him and immediately began a series of defensive turns, using his aircraft's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to try to outturn the damaged F-22. What followed was a masterclass in aerial gunnery. The two fighters rolled and climbed and dove in a three-dimensional dance that covered dozens of miles of sky. Sarah would gain a firing position only to have the enemy pilot roll away at the last second, while his attempts to reverse the engagement were thwarted by her superior situational awareness and tactical experience. At 15,000 feet above the South China Sea, the Su-35 pilot made his first significant mistake. He pulled too hard in a climbing turn, bleeding off airspeed in an attempt to force Sarah to overshoot his position. But Sarah had anticipated the maneuver and had already begun to adjust her flight path. As the enemy fighter's speed dropped below 300 knots, she found herself with a perfect deflection shot. The Vulcan cannon roared for exactly 1.2 seconds, sending 60 rounds of high-explosive ammunition into the Su-35's starboard wing and engine bay. The effect was devastating. The enemy fighter's right engine exploded in a shower of burning fuel and metal fragments, while his starboard wing began to separate from the fuselage. The pilot had no choice but to eject, his parachute deploying just as his aircraft rolled over and began its final dive. Splash 9, Sarah announced, but her celebration was premature. The final Su-35 was diving toward her position with guns blazing, its pilot determined to avenge his fallen comrades. Sarah could see the muzzle flashes of his 30mm cannon and feel the aircraft shake as several rounds struck her starboard wing. Her fuel gauge showed 0. Both engines began to surge and stumble as the fuel pumps began drawing air instead of aviation gas. Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds of powered flight remaining before she would be forced to glide the F-22 toward an emergency landing. But 30 seconds was enough time to end this fight, one way or another. The final enemy pilot was closing fast, his aircraft slightly above and behind Sarah's position. It was a perfect attack angle, one that would allow him to rake her aircraft with cannon fire while minimizing his exposure to return fire. But Sarah had one advantage that he couldn't see. She was no longer afraid of dying. Instead of trying to evade the attack, Sarah rolled her crippled F-22 directly toward the approaching Su-35. The enemy pilot saw her turn and adjusted his aim, confident that the damaged American fighter was making a desperate last attempt to ram his aircraft. He was so focused on avoiding a collision that he never saw Sarah's cannon muzzle swing toward his position. At a range of 800 yards, with both aircraft closing at over 1,000 miles per hour, Sarah squeezed the trigger. The Vulcan cannon fired its final 120 rounds in a tight burst that converged on the Su-35's cockpit and forward fuselage. The enemy fighter disappeared in an explosion of glass and metal, its pilot killed instantly as high-explosive rounds tore through his aircraft's vital systems. Splash 10, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her dying engines. The final enemy fighter tumbled toward the ocean in a shower of burning debris, marking the end of the most intense aerial combat engagement in modern military history. But Sarah's own aircraft was also dying. Both engines flamed out simultaneously as the last drops of fuel were consumed, leaving her flying a 65,000-pound glider at 20,000 feet above the South China Sea. She had perhaps 6 minutes to find a suitable landing site, assuming her damaged flight controls could maintain stable flight. Control, Falcon 1. Mission accomplished. All hostile aircraft destroyed. I am declaring an emergency. Both engines out. fuel exhausted, attempting emergency landing. The response was immediate and emotional. Falcon 1, outstanding work. We have emergency recovery assets en route to your position. Nearest friendly airfield is Kadena, bearing 270, distance 120 miles. Sarah looked at her glide computer and shook her head. The F-22 had a glide ratio of approximately 1.5 to 1, which meant she could travel about 30 miles for every 20,000 feet of altitude. With significant battle damage affecting her aerodynamics, she would be lucky to make 60 miles before reaching sea level. But Captain Sarah Martinez had not survived the impossible odds of a 12-to-1 engagement only to give up now. She trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed and began a shallow descent toward the distant coastline. Behind her, 10 columns of smoke marked the grave sights of the enemy fighters that had dared to challenge her in the sky. 43 minutes later, Sarah Martinez became the first pilot in history to successfully dead-stick land an F-22 Raptor on a highway. The 6-lane expressway on the outskirts of Manila provided just enough length for her approach, and Philippine emergency services had cleared the roadway of traffic after receiving notification from American military controllers. The F-22 touched down hard. Its landing gear extended manually through the emergency system. Sarah held the aircraft straight as it rolled for over 2 miles, finally coming to rest against the center-median barrier with steam rising from its overheated brakes. She sat in the cockpit for several moments, unable to believe that she was still alive. When the rescue helicopters arrived 20 minutes later, they found Captain Sarah Martinez standing beside her damaged aircraft, still wearing her flight suit and helmet. She had single-handedly destroyed 10 enemy fighters in aerial combat, a feat that military historians would compare to the greatest aces of World War II. The engagement lasted exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds. In that brief span of time, Sarah Martinez had rewritten the tactical manuals and proven that individual skill, when combined with superior technology and unshakable determination, could overcome seemingly impossible odds. She would later receive the Medal of Honor for her actions that day, becoming only the second woman in American military history to receive the nation's highest decoration for valor. But for Sarah, the greatest reward was simpler. She had faced the ultimate test of aerial combat and emerged victorious, proving to herself and the world that the sky belonged to those brave enough to claim it. The legend of the pilot who turned a 12-to-1 ambush into her personal triumph would inspire fighter pilots for generations to come. And somewhere high above the clouds, the spirit of aerial combat had found its perfect expression in the actions of Captain Sarah Martinez, call sign Falcon, the woman who made the impossible look routine.